Today I'm going to talk about some techniques in mural painting. Obviously, we've sort of transcended the expectation that all murals need to be physically a part of the wall. They're not any longer simply frescoes, especially as artists started to move outside. But the point in mural painting has for sure changed over time, especially in the 20th century, as murals become a little bit more of a voice and an expression of community ideology. They've always been about politics, but what an outdoor mural does is it literally puts your work in the community that lives with it on a daily basis, and interacts with it on a daily basis. As a muralist, you will not typically have your work seen as a simple painter, a studio painter. You won't have your work seen by as wide of an audience as a mural painting. I have a mural in downtown Memphis, and I can guarantee you that there are 1 million tourists in Memphis a year. And that million might be 500,000 that walk in that alley to go to Rendezvous Ribs, right, which is right there. So it is a real quick way to get your work exposure. It generally serves as a really, really clear and effective way of communication, especially dealing with politics, social issues, identities of the community itself. It can be very uplifting. And for the most part, people do agree in various communities that are urban that it does add a kind of aesthetic improvement, even though that's very debatable. Because its origins are essentially graffiti, right? Which is putting your mark out there. There are some cons to mural painting. When you become a mural painter, you are subject to the approval, typically, of a multitude of people. It tends to just be a small group of people that are stakeholders, what we call stakeholders. So for instance, it might be the buildings near and around and adjacent to where that mural is. It might be the business owners of that community. It might be that community itself. And actually having a unified perspective on that can be very difficult because you are having a lot of cooks in that kitchen. Can you add this? Can you make it bigger? Can you put the bridge in? So oftentimes it can be much of a politic position to be in. Funding is huge. It costs a lot of money to do a multicolor mural. It really does. It is physically an endeavor that is very big in general, but the actual paint coverage itself can be exceedingly expensive, especially if what you're using is things like high grade spray paint. Outdoor conditions are awful. I've painted in 100 degrees and I've painted in sub-freezing weather. And as you know, paint freezes. And hot weather, being really high on some scaffolding, is generally not the safest place to be. So it is a physically very arduous position to be in. And a lot of people do not do murals on the regular for that reason. The public unpredictability. Someone took a poop in my alley the week I was painting the mural.
Like while you were there?
In the evening. You are in a community, in an urban area that has, economic, disparity and depression. People living outside, sleeping near your mural. But it also is a kind of, it is unpredictable. I had lots of people walking by, asking for my cards, asking me to do other murals. So it is definitely a kind of experience that offers up, you never know what, right? And everyone does have an opinion. Sometimes it's a terrible opinion. Sometimes people will drive by and yell at you, and sometimes people will drive by and say, great work. So it is really, you are with the community while you're making this thing. Did I not spell municipal right? It looks like I didn't. So the types of spaces murals can be in vary, right? Thus defining what the subject matter is. It can be public, which has a board or a civic union. The Downtown Memphis Commission was the one who approved mine. It can be commercial, so it can be a store owner of a coffee shop that says, I really need a coffee shop mural, right? And it can also be private. A lot of people do home murals. They're especially popular in children's homes, but faux painting is a very viable career, and a lot of people do that on the regular.
Is that what the private?
The lower right-hand corner there, that's a faux painting. A lot of people just don't want wallpaper. But there is handmade wallpaper, and you can interact with it in a sort of original, one-of-a-kind way. And then a private example here of a sort of installed work, which adds to the sort of interior design that already exists. And so as you develop a sort of artistic voice, people will potentially want to claim that by having a permanent component in their home. Some of it can simply be decorative, a visual experience that is not about politics, that is not about an ideology, that is simply about integrating an interesting aesthetic experience into the urban environment. Some of them can be very political. And I want you to note that this one's kind of interesting in that it encroaches on the walkway itself, so it becomes very hard to ignore. So various things that you'd need as a mural painter is a list. When you do a mural proposal, you will include an inventory of expenses. And those expenses will be tallied up. From one brush to one color of paint to a drop cloth. All of that will be tallied up in order to create your budget on top of the labor costs that basically you arbitrarily assigned. So generally things that might be included, acrylic paints in a selection of colors. I typically like to use outdoor exterior latex. It weathers very well, and it's meant for the outdoors, and it operates a lot like just general acrylics. You can just use acrylics. However, I like the ease and convenience of being able to just simply go into my local paint store and have them mix colors from my swatches. Empty containers, you will need to prime. Generally, they require, and that's a part of the contract, a kind of primer. And in the end, there might actually be a requirement in the contract of graffiti-resistant coating, which is a type of clear paint that you can buy that requires hot water and soap just to wash off spray paint graffiti on top of your mural. Rollers, roller pads, extension handles for your rollers, rags, drop cloths, buckets, yardsticks, masking tape. I've used all of this in murals. You will mix colors, so lots and lots and lots of cups for that. Wire brushes to get the guck off. It's outdoor. There might be disgusting things falling off of that wall. On that wall, it might just be, you need to get a little bit of the grout out in between the bricks. Eye protection, ladders, and scaffolding. Scaffolding costs money to rent. It does. And a lift costs a lot of money to rent. But scaffolding tends to be very safe in that it's immobile. But you do, and I would recommend that if you ever use scaffolding, that you harness in. And you can rent harnesses that go around your middle section and will protect you from killing yourself. And then a paint spraying system. Some people use paint spray, like commercial sprayers. I actually have one in my office if anyone's ever interested in using it. And milk crates and things to stand on for ease of reach. So in terms of different methodologies, there are various ones. This is the method I use. I use a grid method. I make a mock-up, I print out that mock-up, I grid that mock-up, and then I use the proportion of the wall to transfer that drawing, much in the same way that you would copy a photograph. Some artists use a projection method. We'll talk about that in a second. This is the easiest thing for me to do in order to avoid any sort of distortion. As I'm close to the surface, it's very, very difficult to be able to see if I've got something wrong, right? So the grid enables me to really get that drawing down. Another way to simply do this is just to use a projector. Transparency projectors are actually the best in terms of clarity. But how do you get out, the electrical to reach outside? Do you have an electrical outlet? Is there a water supply near you?
Can you set in the light, like in the sun?
You do it in the dark.
Oh.
You wait for the sun to go down. I really like using a projector as well, but a projector might not be an option if you're painting, say, in an alleyway, right? Because you might not have that 30 feet that you need in order to make a large image. So it needs to be painted beforehand. There needs to be something on the wall, whether it be pre-painted and it exists before you, but you never want to actually put color on a bald wall. It will not take, and you'll have to do coat after coat after coat. So a primer really is required, and it needs to be cleaned. So you don't actually need to use a gesso for that. You just need to use an exterior latex primer, would be fine. The surface of the wall is actually really important. The wall in the interior here is slick, right? It's just cinder block that's been painted with a latex. If it's been primed with oil, you have to paint oil on it, which is terrible because in your contract it will say must last for 20 years. And if it doesn't, and if it starts to fall apart, you've got to come in and repair it every time.
Are these just?
This is just acrylic, a latex. So the smoother a wall, the better. If you're painting on a brick wall that has really deep grooves of where the mortar is, that is miserable. Take my word for it. So you actually do want to scout out the wall that you're proposing this painting for. Because you might get there and it might just be the worst experience of your life. You might not be able to do the technical things that you thought you'd be able to do depending on that surface that you have to respond to. Yep.
Big indents in between when we were just like
Oh.
shoving paint in pretty much.
Yes, and it really does inhibit the facility of being able to apply the paint, but also like just the technical things to be able to blend, right? Which is why a lot of people use spray paint. A lot of people use spray paint for that reason. So there are mural paints. It's called Mural Paint. It's very bright and vibrant, and they're suitable for indoor or outdoor use. Generally, you don't want to use oil-based paint. You want to avoid that at all costs. Oil-based paint is generally much more responsive to the weather, and it will expand and contract, and it will crack. So latex is really very malleable because it's plastic, right? So it's sealed against the elements in a way that has some longevity to it. Some people do lots of interesting techniques. You can do an underpainting like you would do a grisaille and use matte medium acrylic to simply, you can buy clear acrylic from your local paint store if you want. And adding just color in order to create a sort of transitional glaze. So the things that you can do on a small scale, you can do on a large scale too. You just have to work quickly if it's an acrylic. You can spray primer onto the wall. That's the easiest way to do it. You can rent sprayers, but really, in all honesty, you can buy a sprayer for about $50, and you can buy the kind that just plug into a wall. They use electrical outlets to project the spray, or you can just use an air compressor if you're familiar with that. Yeah. So some artists will prefer to do an underpainting in another material, like spray paint, and then prefer to do hand labor over the top of that for more refined description. So that's always an option as well. There's a type of technique called Maroflage. It's a fun word. It basically means that you paint on another surface, and then you use an adhesive in order to put it on the wall. So what I've got here, a thin coat of adhesive is applied to both the wall and the canvas. It's a very, very, very thin canvas, a lot like muslin or a silken material. Today we use a substance called polytab, which is the kind of fabric used for parachutes. And you would paint this in your studio, and you would basically just sort of glue the back and then glue the front to adhere it, semi-permanently to the wall. You can use pressure in order, like a brayer, or hand rollers in order to smooth it on there, and then you trim it, essentially, to the space itself to remove any bubbles. This is a permanent affixture. Now, when you want it to come down, you have to peel it off, but it weathers the elements much in the same way that a normal mural would.
Would you peel it off, would it ruin the mural itself?
Not necessarily, it depends on how you apply the material. I will say this, it will probably change the texture of the wall, and it might change the wall's color because it's clear acrylic. So it depends. Some people can use wheat paste. There are murals that you can put up that are meant to decay. They did a whole project in Memphis of these enormous reproductions of Brooks paintings, the Brooks Museum paintings, on the sides of derelict buildings with just wheat paste and basically photocopied paper, thin paper. And it took about 2 months for it to sort of dissipate with the weather. And it was a great project, really cool project, and meant to be very temporary. You can also complete tile murals. So this would entail literally painting murals pre-firing. So you're basically sort of painting in the way you would normally do ceramics, and you've planned it out, and you've created this grid work, essentially, that is meant to be permanently installed in a space. And that will last forever. Forever. You can approach painting in a way that has all kinds of surface textures. So what I've got here is you can achieve a sort of impressionist approach by simply painting an underpainting and only using lights on top of that in order to create a kind of harmonious effect. You can let it drip. You can do all of the things that you normally do within the parameters of expressing your voice and techniques. You just have to figure out how to essentially make it last. So you can use wet color mixing, you can use layering, you can use dry brush, you can use fresco if you want. But generally, using large quantities of colors is the way to go. I adhere to the logic of making sure I have a very accurate drawing. I don't like surprises, especially when they're that expensive to have to deal with. So this is Big Ange, and this is painted on a wall in Staten Island, and what you see is an entire painting done on cinder block that has been primed, and the painting is done using entirely spray paint. But you notice that blue tape there is meant to block off the area that doesn't need color, right? Yeah. So you see all that blue tape there. So it's essentially painted in section by section by section by section, which is a very appropriate way, which is honestly why you're going to see a lot of pastiche as mural painting, right? Because you can work a small area. And really that does mimic the sort of fresco tradition in that in a fresco, you put the plaster on only in sections and you complete what you can do in a day. And then the next day you add on more plaster and you complete the next section. So it's very, very similar to that. And in all honesty, it really does it strips away a little bit of the sort of like overwhelming nature of the scale of the project because you're just ticking away. It's a marathon rather than a sprint. So there's the Big Ange painting. And of course, Big Ange from television, from the Wives of Staten Island or New Jersey, Housewives of New Jersey or something like that. Yeah. So that's done in Staten Island there, right? So a limited palette can also be used. That oftentimes is very harmonious to an interior space that one would live. It's also cheaper to produce because you're only pulling from a limited palette. Oh, and you see that the small mural there in the corner, that's actually completed with markers. Markers. You can use paint markers? Absolutely. So another limited palette example, red, pink, black, and white. So a full color mural can be a sort of difficult thing to behold. It can be an aesthetic challenge to be able to take it in. And I've got a Diego Rivera, which I talked about in the very first lecture, but the best way, I think, if you're going to do a full color mural that has dozens of colors is to actually do it in a sort of grisaille method, to paint the entire thing in black and white and then just simply lay the color over in glazes. That really is the way to economize your use of pigment, truly, and cost.
Because you would use less paint that way, well, like color paint.
Indeed, you would use far less paint. And that's essentially why we glazed in the beginning, was its colors were very, very, very expensive. So glazing as a whole is a way to sort of tonally push an image back. You note that the painting here is painted first, and then the glaze, or the stain, is put over it in order to create a sort of texture of age. You know, it's meant to look as if it's been there for long periods of time. And this can simply be done with, clear acrylic, clear latex, right? Or oil, if you want, if you're all done with the painting part. So this is done by a guy named John Weber. So he does the entire thing in black and white first, and you see he's using the very standard approach of grisaille, and it's a similar process to obviously the art historical examples. And here we have a gold paint pen being employed. This is really popular for people who want to make an entirely, exclusively devoted mural to line, right? So I'm going to be real with you. A mural will take a long period of time. If you don't have many hands, it can take months if you're the only person working on it. When I propose a mural, I absolutely know that I am going to employ other people to help me complete it. And I employ and tap people that are looking for the work, but have the skill sets that I need. And so that becomes a part of the budget, always. When I divide the hours up of, say, the last mural that I did, it would have taken me 40 hours a week, a whole month to do. I did it in a week with paid labor. I didn't make any money on it, but I now have a mural in a major metropolitan area, right, that's heavily visited. Right. So it is sort of advertising, but you do have to kind of account for that. I would have honestly paid myself more in the proposal had I known how much labor I needed to pay for it, but I needed to do over spring break. So that's something to think about. When you finish a mural, excuse me, you need to use a matte or semi-gloss acrylic finish at the very bare minimum. If you don't do that, you need to use what's called graffiti repellent. And it can be sprayed on simply. It's just a simple one coat, maybe two, that will absolutely reject graffiti. It won't physically reject it. If someone comes in and with a magic marker, they will, or someone comes in with a big old ego and some spray paint, what you can do is you can simply use a hot water method and spray, like a pressure washer, right off. How dependable is it? I don't know. Really, to be perfectly honest with you, I have no idea. But it is part of the expense, and it is $100 for a 5-gallon bucket of it. So it needs to be included in that list. So this talks a little bit about the graffiti protection. It's called Soluvar. Liquitex makes it. You can use it inside or out, and people will deface murals. They do it all the time. If the tradition of murals is graffiti, the idea of graffiti is to put one name over the other. So that tag is a mark of your presence. And so if you were in an open urban space, you will contend with that. And I have already done repairs on mine. So there's the buon fresco technique, and then there's the fresco secco technique. And the buon fresco is a tried and true. It means good fresco, good fresh. Okay, that's what it translates to. And it's simply painting pigment with water, so it's just watered down pigment. Sometimes you can add egg to it, but you don't really need to, onto the wet plaster. And obviously the wet plaster is not like cake batter, but it's a softer surface. It's a lot like working on wet paper in watercolor. And it looks really light when you put it on there, but actually darkens while it dries. So there isn't multiple layers on the Sistine Chapel. It just darkened, and it looked like watercolor while he was painting it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Whenever we were
Yes.
beforehand?
So the thing that most traditional painters kind of hate about acrylic is that acrylics are fugitive, working fugitive. That means that they will change in both sheen and in darkness while it dries. Fresco's exact same way. And yes, you can always do a test. Absolutely, you can. And you can chip off what you screw up on a buon fresco. But it becomes part of the wall. So the idea is that it's there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So those frescoes that were done 600 years ago because, well, they just weren't affected by the earthquakes that came, right? They are literally 2 inches deep because that pigment becomes part of the wall. There are ways of skimming a wall. If you know anything about just, drywall is just paper over gypsum board, right? Gypsum made into a powdery paste that dries. Some people, when a painting has become, and it's not fresco, but when a mural has become part of a wall that they want to preserve, you can actually bring in conservators and skim the wall off, that first couple of surfaces. So that's what's happened a lot in the United States with just paintings on walls. They've been skimmed, okay? Then we have a fresco secco, which is painting done on dry plaster. So a lot of people will do a buon fresco and then do a second pass on the dry plaster that is not part of the wall. So any cleaning, just any scrubbing on that wall that's done just from like soot, candle soot, that will come off. So it needs to be handled in a very, very different way. But you can use glues in order to keep it on there in the best manner you can. Then you have meso fresco, which is painted on nearly dry plaster. And it comes from, very early form of just an approach of mural painting today, right? We can't call fresco mural painting, even though that's really what it is. So the pigment only penetrates very, very, very lightly into the plaster, okay? So it's kind of part of the wall, but not really. So the idea of fresco is that that aggregate that is behind that final layer becomes a part of it. And so the cartoon is placed over the wet plaster, so the drawing is done on regular paper. It's usually thin paper, like a kind of, what do you call it? Like a tracing paper. You do the drawing in there, and then you have an assistant poke holes all the way around your line drawing, and then you just tamp it very, very simply with charcoal in order to get it on that wet plaster, because you have to work quickly, right? You don't want to spend time drawing while your plaster is drying. It's very valuable time. So you essentially add that water-based paint onto the damp intonaco, is what that layer is called. And the intonaco layer is the final smooth coat of plaster, okay? So the layer of rough plaster is called the iriccio, and then the final upper layer is the intonaco. So here we have a fresco workshop reproducing, famous works of art, and this, of course, is pulling from Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And you see that it can be very, very profoundly colorful, depending on the quality of pigments that you use, depending on the texture and thickness and density of the paint, etc., etc. And so here we have an artist tamping the drawing with the small little prick marks. And you see that the artist has drawn out the mural. You see that on the upper left-hand corner? He's drawn it out. And what he'll do is early on in the morning, he will lay that plaster only in the area that he thinks he can complete during that day, and just in that shape, okay? So it's done in a segmented manner. So you see it's tamped on there. And all fresco, buon fresco, is completed in this way. Here we have Diego Rivera doing it. And then you see someone chipping away at the edges because that's not needed for that day. You got to do it over, right? And then here we have some early scaffolding, very early scaffolding of what that would have looked like in say, the Renaissance. Wood scaffolding, and you would have just used and reused and used and reused. More early scaffolding. It's scary, I'm not going to lie. They did tie themselves up with rope They absolutely did. They were careful. And then we have someone skimming a wall. So this is painted, they're literally trying to transfer what was on the wall onto a canvas. It's not very ethical, but it's done. So you can use canvas with an adhesive backing. There is stick-on canvas rolls. That is possible, especially if you want to preserve the mural itself. I wouldn't recommend it because canvas moves with humidity. So how long is it going to stick up there? I don't know. All right, so when you're starting a mural business, you want to think of a few things. You're going to be expected to give quotes. You need money up front to start a mural in order to buy your supplies. Usually, it's 1/3 to a half of your budget. Expect it. Do not start doing a mural with at least 1/3 of the budget given to you. Highly recommend that. I would start small. Don't take a big project right off the get-go. You can pay yourself by the hour. You can also pay yourself by the square foot. I actually price by the square foot because of the cost and expense of the brushes and the colors of paint. Or you can have just simply a base fee. I will not do this for under $10,000, right? And when you've reached a reputation, you can definitely charge by base fee. You do want to think about location, storage, ladders, scaffolding, projectors, and assistants. All of those things, especially if you're traveling, need to be dealt with. Is there a place for you to put your scaffolding at the end of the day? Because scaffolding comes apart. You can roll it, or you can just break it down and put it somewhere, which I've done before. And it needs to be done probably with an assistant. It's very difficult to do on your own. Do you have to pay yourself in order to stay there? A per diem, the cost of eating, a hotel. All those things would need to be included in your quotes. Generally, you submit a kind of presentation, essentially. You want to use the skills that you've been building as a fine artist in school and use the powers of description in order to talk about what your mural means, why it's important to that community, why it's important to the history of the space. So things like, playrooms or a pediatrician's office, will require a very different approach and presentation to a public arts project, right? So make sure you know your audience when you submit those presentations. So pricing, which is what you're really interested in. And we're going to read this. According to redbeacon.com, the average price nationally for a custom mural is $537 for a work 4 foot by 4 foot, which could be $16 per square foot. An entire room averages $1,800, which for a normal room of, say, 12 by 14 feet with 8-foot ceilings could be $4 per square foot. So that it changes based on the space. The charges generally go up when there are obstacles, when there's a tall, huge wall, when you've got to rent things, when it's outdoors. You can get the most money for trompe-l'oeil designs and hyper-realistic art. People just adore that stuff, especially when it comes to public arts murals. You want to think about simplicity if you're doing a child's room, right? You don't want to expend all of your time, resources, and energies on something that might not necessarily be appreciated and might be colored over with marker. Some people charge per hour. So Cindy Barra Webster charges $60 an hour. That's just for painting. You do get paid for your proposed design. Typically, when there's a call for entries, they will ask for you to just apply with maybe your website or your portfolio, and then they'll do a short list and say 5 of you have been chosen to come up with a design. You will be paid for that design. It is not their intellectual property, though. So they'll pay you for your time in designing it, but you might not be chosen. So just know that as well. You want to have any pot you've had your fingers in regarding murals, even if you're just assisting, is a part of your creation, even though the design might not be. You just want to be opaque about that, or transparent about that. You can have it on your website. You can have cards on you while you're painting it, trust me. Have a different Instagram or Facebook if you're trying to set up a side hustle. You want to have price sheets, be able to give a verbal quote. So think about those things when you start, because know that people will approach you. Workshops are great to make money, always. They're a great way to make money. And teaching opportunities. So have a separate maybe account for your art business. That will be important when it comes to taxes. Here's an example of a price sheet. And I want you to note that the big part of this price sheet includes the specifics exactly. Square foot, is it complex versus not complex? He's got various prices per size. And the non-refundable design and sketch fee, it's $1,500, right? And I'm going to remind you here, the client might not like what you're proposing. And if they don't, that's a negotiation. And so you might be asked to do something twice. Have that in there. So this is a sort of contractual agreement. And yeah, I would have them sign it. Absolutely. You don't want to get stiffed. Travel is included. Rental equipment is included in that price. So he doesn't actually include all the specifics about what he's going to pay, how many people he's going to hire, etc. And then any other addendums that he might have as an asterisk, right? So that's an example of one that might be pretty spot on for a professional. In the proposal process, you're emailing somebody a price sheet, or you're giving it to them in physical form. You're gathering details about that mural as you're scoping it out. What's that wall look like? Is there going to be traffic? Do you need to get with the city to close off traffic right near that mural so that you're not hanging from scaffolding next to semis driving by you? Right? All those things are important. Your written proposal is pretty simple, and the description of how you're to be paid is specific. Unless it's a call. If it's a citywide call, they generally have their own process for payment. Be clear and direct about everything. Be anal retentive about your expectations. Make sure it's agreed upon both verbally and written. Get it in an email. Always get it on paper. Don't be flexible. Yeah, I'll give you $150 to do this. Yeah, that's not quite written. People will generally honor something that they've signed. So some examples of interesting murals that we'll end on. Any questions before I shut down the recording? Okay.